Chapter 7, Depth and Camera. Okay, so I want to talk about kind of depth and camera and atmospheric and volumetric lighting. So let's start with looking at something like this. All right, so we've already talked about subsurface scattering and the way when light hits certain surfaces, the light kind of scatters off of the individual particles inside, like skin or something, plastic, something where the light's semi-translucent objects. All right, so here's an example of an ant farm with the light kind of coming into the in through this. This is kind of like a gel that the ants built these tunnels through. We've got these bright little LED lights on the bottom, and we're getting this volumetric light, meaning it kind of bounces off of the 3D space in here, kind of fades out. You got this kind of, by the time it gets to the far edges, it's it's diffused quite a bit, but it's diffusing through a surface. Quick little note, look at the color temperature here, these deep saturated blues, and as it gets brighter it goes more towards aqua and then towards white, so more proof of that kind of theory. So some things are kind of diluted by depth. The way the light kind of comes in. This is a cup of tea, and it kind of fades off. The light gets darker and darker the deeper it goes into the tea because the light is being diffused through it. I'm going to call this kind of like volumetric lighting. Here's another example of this shopping cart somebody threw into this lake. It kind of fades off based on distance. So it becomes good to understand when we're starting to mimic certain things in life, like a river, or water. There's kind of the depth of what happens, just simply because the water kind of diffuses the light that's coming down in. The deeper you go, the more kind of murky it can become. Also, the sunlight, if you notice in this bright spot coming through here, kind of reflects off of the water itself and gives this kind of glow. Looking down this cliff into the ocean too, you get that kind of fall off of color as it gets deeper and deeper. Same with lakes. The reason why it's crisper and cleaner is the water's thinner, and as it gets deeper and deeper, there's more volume of the light to diffuse through the water. So we get, it almost, it's this real deep blue. Most of that's reflection of the sky, but that kind of subtle darkening of the water. Notice here all these nice caustics too, from the light coming in, being warped through the surface and getting these little highlights all over here. Nice caustics on the floor. This is an interesting example to kind of study. It's kind of a mix of like subsurface scattering. So the sunlight comes in, goes through the water, and what we're seeing here, it's almost like the shadows have this haze around them, this kind of dark. And the reason we see this kind of very soft kind of gradient around everything is because the light is coming in, and what the light that we're seeing here is not just off the surface. We're seeing the light bounce under the water for a few feet and then bounce back out at us. So this shadow line here, once it goes under the water, the shadow gets diffused, so some of that shadow is bleeding into this lighter area. So that's why we get this kind of haze around here. Same with around here, some of this we're seeing the transparency of these rocks kind of going deeper underneath. But you can actually see on this kind of edge here, the light under the water, the bright spot is bleeding into the shadowed area. So we get this kind of bleed of color both in the shadows and in the light. As the light diffuses underneath the water, bounces off the water particles, and then enters, exits again back through the surface towards our eyes. Here's another example of, the sunlight or the light in here that's coming in is being diffused off of the individual particles of water. Now, this is really the power of understanding, kind of volumetric light, is you can give a real sense of distance and depth. The reason why I can tell that this fish is closer than this fish, one, there's scale, but two, there's a lot of, kind of depth and atmosphere, compared to this fish back here that's, really, really affected by, this volumetric light through the water. The darkest things are closest, so there's the most amount of contrast. The blacks are the strongest. And as you get into different areas of depth from your eye, there's less and less contrast because the light is bouncing off of all the water in this particular case. in between us and the background. Which brings up a point of, air does the same thing. Actually it's the water in the air for atmosphere. So it's a good tool for understanding, all right, this rock is close, the amount of contrast compared to over here, that there's no level of black that's quite as dark compared to way back here. This is in Yosemite, and this is it's about a half-a-mile drop straight down here. So this area back here is probably about 2 miles away. And there's quite a bit of haze, but the only way that our eye can tell from looking at this image how far this is away, that gives you that sense of scale, is, there's some scale with the trees and stuff like that, but it's mostly the atmosphere that your eye instantly says, wow, that's a long ways away, I wouldn't want to fall off this little ledge. Even in things not quite so big and grand, these buildings, the only way that we can tell that these buildings are farther away, we get that sense of scale, is because of the atmosphere. This kind of glow from the sun bouncing off of the atmosphere. Another reason here to show sense of depth and kind of layering. Well, the foreground stuff, the blacks are really dark, but then the city that's way across the bay has this kind of nice haze. Choosing the colors here, it's silhouetted, but it has the haze of the atmosphere in between us and the city. Same thing happens early morning. Get this nice kind of soft haze that affects all the colors. And of course, things like fog, you get that, as distance goes back. Quite a powerful tool for creating emotion in images, to be able to have, this kind of creepy, dark, elusive fog, or something, again, same kind of thing. Drawing your eye, using it as a compositional element to give a sense of depth and space and color, and kind of vignette the image, with the darker things, kind of framing the image. Another quick example, just fog as the losing contrast based on distance. It's amazing looking at a ton of different photo references. You realize that, atmosphere and the light does a lot of stuff that's very strong. You think, if I'm going to paint a village, I'm going to paint the village here and the mountain here. If you actually think about the way the shadows work and the way the atmosphere, that's a lot of haze, but to the time you get back here, you can almost not even see the mountain. All right, so atmosphere definitely is affected by light. One other thing that's noteworthy here is to think about atmosphere. It is angle dependent, so we got the bright sun kind of being backlit here and these beams kind of coming down. There's something that I like to call kind of like a atmospheric specular diffusion, where the specular highlight. Remember a couple chapters ago when we were talking about the law of reflection. It says if light comes in at one angle, it kind of goes out at a similar angle. So if you get kind of a grazing light off of a surface, light, so say there's light here and I was standing right here, you get this nice hot highlight. If you were to walk around back, it wouldn't seem quite so bright, simply because we're getting like a hot specular off of the, kind of that angle coming into our eyes. So the same thing happens with atmosphere. When the light comes and it hits these little particles in the air, it's going to give this real bright, kind of beams when we're looking at kind of backlit. But if we were to walk around this bush and look back, I don't think we would see these rays at all. Mainly because we're catching it at a, kind of a back angle. We're catching more light from this angle because of the specular reflection off of these microscopic particles. So interesting thing to think about, that the glow around the sunlight kind of depends on the angle that you're looking at it. Here we have another kind of the way this shows depth as it kind of goes deeper into the forest, and the atmosphere here is giving us a real good sense of scale. Something like this, we're getting the same thing. We're getting kind of the blowout of this light, all these really hot highlights here. But it's affecting the atmosphere and giving us this kind of layering, so we can tell the depth simply because of the way the light is kind of blooming. Another thing here, this is another example of where the light is just where the sun is. If I were to be looking the opposite direction, I wouldn't get as bright of a glow off the atmosphere. I'd get some, but because I'm looking directly at the sun and it's kind of, lighting right from the kind of backlit here, we're getting more of a glow and a haze because of the angle. There's another example of showing this kind of, you can see the actual atmosphere interacting with the sunlight as the beams come through here. It doesn't affect over here because there's no sunbeams bouncing off the atmosphere, but here we're getting the direct kind of reflection of the sun off of the atmosphere that provides this kind of glow. So again, we get these nice gradients. So I like showing these. Something that I find all the time in nature is these gradients. So gradients of color, gradients of tone. Like the color temperature thing, you get these gradients of, the actual, it's more yellow to more orange, this kind of fall off, but also gradients of tone where it's brighter and then it slowly gets darker, and you get all these kind of, this layering, these gradients here. We can tell the distance, that this is closer than the background because of the colors here. We get this nice shadow. You can kind of see the subtle shadow of the light. It's bouncing off the atmosphere here, but less here because this is in shadow. All right, so that's kind of atmospheric volumetric lighting. We'll look at some practical examples of how to use this, but it's really good to understand. It's a pretty prevalent thing in nature to see the effect of atmosphere and volume and light kind of diffusing through volumetric materials like air and water. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of camera effects. So if we notice here, we've got this hot highlight from the sun. When you're looking at a TV or you're looking at your computer monitor, all it can display is values from 0 to 1, which means 0 being black and 1 being white. And it's hard to display anything brighter than that. But in the real world, when you go out, your eyes will adjust, and we're not limited to a 0 to 1 scale. The sun is actually, tremendously intense. And so my camera, when taking this image, it was adjusted for the light that it sees here, and is interpreting the image from 0 to 1, giving me all of these pixels, and saying, all right, this is a value of 1, and this is a value, a little bit of yellow in here, and getting all these different colors. But when it gets to the sun is so bright it has to go way above 1. It can't even take this in. So we're getting some of these artifacts because of the brightness that are coming off of the lens of the camera, and we're getting this kind of bloom, and we're getting a star filter. So part of that's from the lens, and part of that's from the intensity of the light and the way the camera it's too much information, so it kind of blooms around it, which is powerful to understand if you want to give the effect of light being very bright. All right, so let's look at some other kind of lens bloom stuff. Here we go. We got the sunlight. Again, it's backlit, so we get this bit of atmosphere here, and you get the hot specular reflections of the sun, but then it blooms out. It gives you this kind of glow, this haze around these buildings because it's too bright for the camera to take in. Other noteworthy things to note in this image is these little lamps and the way the light diffuses through this glass, and we're getting some kind of scattering in here, some diffusion through this translucent glass. Same with, we're getting the kind of subsurface scattering somewhat of the translucency on these leaves as the sun hits the other side and makes them glow. All right, so this is another example of camera bloom. So the light is coming in, the camera is adjusted for this room, and the light that's bouncing off of this guy's shirt. But the actual light here is so bright, we're getting this extreme haze as it, kind of falls off. So another couple little examples. This nice little hot bloom of the direct sunlight off of these buildings adds a nice little, twinkle, a little touch, a little bit of life to the image. If those weren't there, it would feel a little bit more flat. It's kind of a nice little highlight there. Look at the atmosphere on these mountains. So the cool of the sky with the kind of orange yellow of the sun, and giving all these nice kind of purples with this atmospheric kind of reflection there. Of course, you get the glow of the light. Some of this is atmosphere, and some of this is bloom from the camera, and some of it is lens flare, way overused in the late 80s and 90s. That whole lens from the sun type of thing. You know, the light that's actually getting reflections off of the lens itself and back into the camera is what that is. There's a couple other things that you know, cameras do that's noteworthy to observe. Of course, motion blur. If things are moving too fast for the frame rate, you know, you get this kind of sense of motion, you know, kind of obvious stuff. And then there's depth of field, where, you know, you kind of how the camera, the focus, very powerful for kind of displaying, you know, if you want to say I want to see something more in focus. I have something. Let's see here. But when I draw my eye to a particular place, say, you know, kind of say none of this stuff is important. You know, I want my eye to go right, you know, to a particular area. Using depth of field in your art as a way to, you know, studying photography and what happens, especially with 3D, being able to understand what happens in the real world. So there's an effect. It's kind of called bokeh. So when things get out of focus, it's not just like a Gaussian blur in Photoshop. We get this effect where the brightest spots blur differently. The kind of, you know, the way the light blurs, it's based off of that whole diffusion and what happens in your eye when you know, when the hotter light kind of that's hard to describe. It's better to just kind of look at these images and say, all right, as light as you know, the focus changes, we're getting these, you know, kind of hot highlights. Sometimes different cameras will give you like a hexagonal, you know, kind of filter. You know, you'll see instead of a clean circle, the way the lens is shaped, you know, you'll get different shapes, but you get this kind of blowout of the brighter spots. Here's another example here as I change. It's interesting to note that, you know, it almost looks like the scale of everything changes when the focus changes. But the brightest spots definitely give the brightest highlights. All right, so there's a lot of different things that happen inside of a camera, and there's a lot of things that happen based on depth and atmosphere. Let's look at a couple painted examples really quickly to kind of show this. So I painted this really quickly. I've got some atmosphere that makes all the these background mountains be kind of hazed out. You know, a little bit of atmosphere that's like fog lying in this little valley. A little bit of subsurface scattering on his wings here. It's another example where I was using the atmosphere to show a sense of depth instead of this being all flat. Kind of the colors I chose were based on, you know, the depth. This area here being a little bit more warm, you know, because the bright light's coming through here, but showing, you know, the as it goes back, I'm kind of hazing the colors a little bit, adding certain tones. You know, it's more cool over here, so adding a little bit of tones. There's some kind of red light, like beams of light kind of coming through, but I'm using that for depth. So here's some examples. Let's talk about some more observations in the next chapter.